In 2018, something shocking happened that no one saw coming. A family in a quiet neighborhood was torn apart by jealousy, anger, and betrayal. Angela was 22 years old and lived with her father and stepmother. But under the surface, there was a storm brewing. Angela and her stepmother, Clarissa, never got along, and things had been tense for a long time. Clarissa was 40, confident, and well put together, but Angela felt she had taken her father's attention away. What seemed like normal arguments between a stepmother and stepdaughter soon became much darker. Angela started feeling like her stepmother was out to get her, and as time went on, her anger grew. She thought her father loved Clarissa more than her, and it made her furious. It wasn't just about their arguments anymore, it became a battle for her father's love. Angela felt ignored, left out, and pushed aside. It hurt her deeply, and that pain turned into rage. On a warm summer night, the family had a small argument at the dinner table, something that seemed harmless at first. But what no one expected was that this argument would turn into something deadly. That night, Angela made a choice that would change their lives forever. In a fit of rage, she went to her stepmother's room while her father was out and took matters into her own hands. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Clarissa was gone, and Angela was standing over her, filled with regret but unable to undo what had just happened. Now, the story of this tragic murder would be shared with the world. Stay with us as we uncover how jealousy and rage led to a deadly act that no one in this family could have predicted. This is the story of a daughter's anger, a stepmother's tragic end, and a father caught in the middle of it all. Angela grew up in a small town, raised by her father after her mother passed away when she was young. Her father, Jonathan, was a hard-working man, always busy with his job as a local businessman. He had raised Angela on his own for many years, and they shared a close bond. Angela was the apple of his eye, and she always felt secure in the love and attention he gave her. Things started to change when Jonathan met Clarissa. Clarissa was a few years younger than Jonathan and seemed to bring new life into the house. At first, Angela was excited. She had longed for a mother figure in her life, and she thought Clarissa could fill that role. But soon after Jonathan and Clarissa got married, things didn't feel the same. Clarissa, who had no children of her own, was eager to build her relationship with Jonathan, and slowly, Angela felt pushed to the side. Jonathan started spending more time with Clarissa and less with his daughter. Angela, now 22, tried to brush it off at first. She was no longer a little girl and thought maybe it was just her imagination. But every time she saw her father and Clarissa laughing together or going out without her, it stung. She felt left out, like she no longer mattered as much. The more Clarissa became part of the family, the more Jonathan seemed to forget about Angela. Even small things, like dinners together, became tense as Jonathan focused more on his wife than his daughter. Angela's resentment towards her stepmother began to grow. It wasn't just about feeling ignored. Angela started to feel like Clarissa was purposely trying to take her father away from her. She felt like an outsider in her own home. Clarissa would make decisions without consulting Angela, and Jonathan seemed to always take Clarissa's side. This made Angela furious. She started to believe that Clarissa had manipulated her father, that she had somehow turned him against her. The warmth that once existed between Angela and Jonathan had disappeared, replaced by cold, awkward silence. Their bond, which once felt unbreakable, was now fragile and strained. Months passed, and the tension in the house continued to build. Angela's frustration turned into anger. She started avoiding her father and Clarissa, spending most of her time locked in her room or out with friends, but no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the bitterness lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that Clarissa was responsible for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Angela convinced herself that if Clarissa weren't around, things would go back to the way they were before. She would have her father's love and attention again. One evening after another tense family dinner, Angela overheard a conversation between her father and Clarissa. They were talking about planning a vacation, just the two of them. Angela felt a wave of rage wash over her. She couldn't believe they were planning a trip without her. To Angela, this was the final straw. She felt completely excluded, like she didn't matter at all. Her father had moved on, and Clarissa had taken her place. In that moment, Angela's anger reached its peak. Later that night, while Jonathan was out meeting a client, Angela and Clarissa were alone in the house. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Angela couldn't take it anymore. Her mind raced with thoughts of how Clarissa had ruined everything, how she had stolen her father's affection. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. It was as if all the resentment she had been holding on to for months came rushing to the surface at once. Without thinking, Angela stormed into the living room where Clarissa was sitting. Clarissa looked up, surprised by Angela's sudden outburst, but before she could say anything, Angela started shouting, She accused Clarissa of stealing her father, of turning him against her. The argument escalated quickly. Clarissa tried to calm Angela down, but Angela was beyond reasoning. Her anger had consumed her, and she no longer cared about what she was saying. All she could think about was how Clarissa had ruined her life. In a fit of rage, Angela grabbed a heavy object from the coffee table and swung it at Clarissa. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, but in reality, it was over in seconds. Clarissa fell to the floor, and the house became eerily silent. Angela stood frozen, her hands shaking as she stared at Clarissa's still body. The weight of what she had just done hit her all at once. She had let her anger take control, and now there was no going back. Angela panicked. She didn't know what to do. Her mind raced as she realized the severity of the situation. Clarissa was gone, and her father would be home soon. She had acted out of anger, and now everything was ruined. Angela paced around the room, her heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do next. But there was no fixing this. The damage was done. When Jonathan arrived home later that night, he found Angela sitting in the living room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. He immediately knew something was wrong. When he saw Clarissa's lifeless body on the floor, his heart sank. The woman he had loved, his wife, was gone. And standing in front of him was his daughter, the one who had taken her life. The story of that night would shock everyone in the town. Angela, once seen as a quiet and well-behaved young woman, had committed an unthinkable crime. The town would soon be buzzing with whispers of what had led to that tragic night, and the investigation that followed would reveal a family torn apart by jealousy and anger. After the murder of Clarissa, Angela found herself in a state of shock. She hadn't planned it, hadn't thought through what would happen next. Her anger had boiled over in a moment, and now she was standing in the aftermath of a crime that couldn't be undone. The reality of the situation hit her like a wave. Clarissa was dead and Angela was responsible. There was no taking it back. The house, once filled with tension and arguments, now felt silent and cold. Angela stood frozen for a while, unable to move. Her heart was racing, her mind a blur of panic and confusion. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, the argument, the shouting, and the final act that had ended everything. She looked at Clarissa's body lying on the floor, and the weight of what she had done began to settle in. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she had to act fast. Time felt like it was slipping away as Angela scrambled to think of a plan. Her father, Jonathan, would be home soon, and she couldn't bear the thought of him finding out what had happened. She needed to make a decision. Should she try to hide what she had done, or should she come clean and face the consequences? Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed right. In her panic, she decided to at least clean up the scene and figure out the rest later. Angela hurried to the kitchen and grabbed some towels, trying to wipe away any traces of what had happened. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, her body numb from the shock. The clock kept ticking, and she knew it was only a matter of time before her father came home. She couldn't clean up everything fast enough, and deep down, she knew it was pointless. The evidence of what had happened was all around her. Just as Angela was finishing up, she heard the sound of the front door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. Jonathan had arrived. Panic surged through her as she quickly dropped the towels and tried to compose herself. But there was no hiding the scene that awaited him. Jonathan stepped inside, calling out for Clarissa, but the house was eerily quiet. It didn't take long for him to notice something was wrong. As Jonathan walked further into the house, he saw Angela standing in the living room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. He could see the tension in her body, the way she was shaking. And then he saw Clarissa. Jonathan froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, was lying lifeless on the floor. His heart broke in that instant, shattered by the sight before him. Angela didn't know what to say. She stood there, silent, as her father's world came crashing down around him. Jonathan rushed to Clarissa's side, but it was too late. The reality of the situation hit him hard. Clarissa was gone, and there was nothing he could do to bring her back. In that moment, the bond between father and daughter was broken in a way that could never be repaired. The next few hours felt like a blur. Jonathan called the police, and Angela knew that the life she once had was over. The house was soon filled with officers and investigators, all trying to piece together what had happened. Angela was taken into custody, her hands shaking as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. She didn't resist. She didn't fight. There was no point. What was done was done. Detective Robinson was assigned to the case. He was a seasoned investigator, known for his calm and methodical approach. He arrived at the house that night, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that this was a random act of violence. It was clear from the start that this was a family tragedy, one born out of anger and resentment. As Detective Robinson spoke with Jonathan, it became clear that Angela had been struggling for a long time. Jonathan explained the tension that had been growing between Angela and Clarissa, the arguments that had started small but had grown more intense over time. He told the detective about Angela's feelings of jealousy, her belief that Clarissa had come between her and her father. It was a painful conversation, one that Jonathan never imagined he would have to have. Angela, meanwhile, sat in the police station, her mind numb. She couldn't process everything that had happened. It all felt like a bad dream, one she couldn't wake up from. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that her life would never be the same. The anger that had driven her to this point had left her, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. As the investigation continued, the full picture of what had happened that night began to emerge. Angela had acted in a fit of rage, unable to control the emotions that had been building up inside her for months. There was no premeditation, no plan to take Clarissa's life. It was a crime born out of a moment of uncontrolled anger, but the consequences were just as real as if it had been planned all along. In the days that followed, the town was abuzz with talk of the murder. People who had known Angela as a quiet, polite young woman were shocked to hear what had happened. The story spread quickly, with everyone trying to understand how things had gone so wrong in a family that from the outside had seemed normal. But for Angela, there was no escaping the reality of what she had done. She knew that she would have to face the consequences of her actions, and that the life she had known was over. As Angela sat in the interrogation room, the reality of her situation continued to sink in. Everything had changed in a single night, and there was no going back. She felt numb, disconnected from the world around her, but she knew that what had happened could never be undone. The room was cold, and the walls seemed to close in on her as she waited for someone to speak to her. The minutes felt like hours as the silence grew heavier. Detective Robinson had spent the previous hours gathering information. He had spoken to Jonathan, who was still in shock from what he had discovered. Jonathan had provided a detailed account of the tension that had built between Angela and Clarissa, the arguments that had escalated over time, and Angela's growing sense of isolation. The detective had a clear picture of a family struggling to hold itself together, but nothing could have prepared him for the final, tragic breakdown. Now it was time to speak to Angela. Detective Robinson entered the room, his expression calm but serious. He had handled cases like this before, family disputes that ended in violence, but each one left its mark. There was always a sense of loss, of something broken that could never be fixed. He took a seat across from Angela, his eyes studying her closely. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of what had happened, but she wasn't resisting. She wasn't fighting the reality that she now faced. He began to ask questions, starting with the events of that evening. Angela's responses were quiet, her voice barely audible at times, but she recounted the argument with Clarissa. She explained how things had escalated, how her anger had taken control. As she spoke, she seemed to be reliving each moment, her mind replaying the scene over and over again. The more she talked, the more it became clear that this wasn't a planned act of violence. It was a spontaneous, tragic outburst born out of months of frustration and jealousy. Angela described how she had felt like she was losing her father, how Clarissa seemed to be taking him away from her. She talked about feeling ignored, left out, and unwanted. Every little action Clarissa took felt like another step in the wrong direction, further pulling Jonathan's attention away from her. She had bottled up her feelings for so long, and that night, everything had finally spilled over. Angela didn't try to justify what she had done. She knew there was no excuse, but she couldn't help feeling like it had been inevitable. The tension had been building for too long, and there had been no release. As Angela finished recounting the events, Detective Robinson took a moment to process everything she had said. It was a familiar story, one of family tensions, unspoken emotions, and unresolved conflict. But the outcome was always tragic. There was no winner in situations like these, only loss. He had seen it time and time again, and it never got easier. The detective left the room briefly, allowing Angela some time to herself. She stared at the table in front of her, her mind swirling with everything that had happened. She knew that she would have to face the consequences of her actions, but the thought of what came next was almost too much to bear. The life she had known was gone, and she couldn't imagine what the future held. For now, all she could do was sit in that cold, empty room and wait. Meanwhile, Jonathan was struggling to come to terms with the loss of his wife. The house, once filled with the warmth of a family, now felt like a shell of its former self. The silence was overwhelming, and every corner of the home seemed to remind him of what had happened. He had lost both his wife and his daughter in a single night, and the weight of that reality was crushing. He couldn't understand how things had spiraled so far out of control, and he couldn't help but blame himself for not seeing the signs earlier. Had he missed something? Could he have prevented this? The days following the murder were a blur for both Jonathan and Angela. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and soon their quiet neighborhood became the center of attention. Reporters gathered outside their home, eager to capture any details they could about the tragic event. The neighbors, who had once seen the family as just another part of the community, were now talking in hushed tones, wondering how such a terrible thing could have happened so close to home. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the family's strained dynamics. Friends and acquaintances of both Angela and Clarissa came forward, offering their perspectives on the situation. Some said they had noticed the tension between the two women, but had never imagined it would lead to something so violent. Others were shocked, insisting that the family had always seemed normal, even happy. But beneath the surface it was clear that things had been unraveling for a long time. Detective Robinson continued his work, piecing together the timeline of events leading up to the murder. Every detail mattered, and he was determined to ensure that justice was served. Angela was eventually charged with manslaughter, and the case was set to go to trial. There would be no easy resolution, no quick end to the pain that both Jonathan and Angela were feeling. The trial would be a long and grueling process, and the outcome was far from certain. As the months passed, the once quiet family was now the subject of endless speculation and gossip. The town had been shaken by the tragedy, and the impact of the event was felt by everyone who knew them. Angela's actions had torn her family apart, and the road to any kind of healing seemed impossibly long. Yet through it all, there was a sense of inevitability. The anger, the resentment, and the jealousy had built up for so long, and without an outlet, it had finally erupted in the worst way possible. Angela's life was changed forever, and the memory of that fateful night would haunt her for the rest of her days. As the trial approached, Angela remained in custody, her fate now resting in the hands of the legal system. The once lively and determined young woman was now a shell of her former self, weighed down by the reality of what had happened. Her days were long and filled with silence, broken only by brief interactions with the prison staff and her attorney. The weight of her crime hung over her like a cloud, a constant reminder of the night she had lost control. Jonathan, too, struggled to cope. His grief was overwhelming, and his once warm and stable home now felt like a prison of memories. Every room in the house reminded him of Clarissa and Angela, of the life he had lost. He could barely bring himself to stay in the house for long, opting instead to spend time at work, or with friends who tried their best to comfort him. But nothing could fill the emptiness he felt. He had lost his wife, and his daughter had committed the crime that tore them apart. The media attention surrounding the case only made things worse for Jonathan. Everywhere he went, people stared and whispered, speculating about what had led to the murder. The neighbors who once greeted him warmly now avoided him, unsure of what to say or how to act. It was as if the tragedy had placed a permanent barrier between Jonathan and the rest of the world. He was living a nightmare, one from which there was no escape. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and legal professionals, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution presented a clear narrative. Angela had become consumed by jealousy and rage, and in a moment of uncontrollable anger, she had taken Clarissa's life. They painted a picture of a troubled young woman who had allowed her emotions to overpower her judgment, resulting in a tragic and violent outcome. The defense, however, focused on the emotional turmoil that Angela had experienced in the months leading up to the crime. Her attorney argued that she had been pushed to her breaking point by the strained relationship with her father and stepmother. They described a young woman who felt abandoned, who believed that her place in the family had been taken from her. Angela's actions, they claimed, were not the result of premeditated intent, but rather a spontaneous reaction to overwhelming emotions. Throughout the trial, Angela remained silent. She listened to the testimony, the arguments, and the evidence presented by both sides, but she said very little. Her attorney had advised her to remain quiet, allowing the legal process to play out. But deep down, Angela knew that no matter what the outcome of the trial was, her life would never be the same again. The trial stretched on for several weeks, with both the prosecution and the defense presenting their cases. Witnesses were called to testify, including Jonathan, who took the stand to share his perspective on the events leading up to the murder. It was a painful experience for him, forced to relive the memories of his wife and daughter, knowing that the bond between them had been broken forever. Jonathan spoke with a quiet sadness, his voice heavy with the weight of his loss. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was tasked with determining Angela's fate. They had heard both sides of the story: the prosecution's claim that Angela's actions were driven by jealousy and rage, and the defense's argument that she had been overwhelmed by emotional distress. It was not an easy decision, and the jury deliberated for several days before reaching a verdict. In the end, Angela was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury believed that while her actions had not been premeditated, they were the result of uncontrolled anger and frustration. The sentence was severe, but not as harsh as it could have been. Angela would spend the next several years in prison, paying the price for the life she had taken. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but for those involved, the pain remained. Jonathan was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, knowing that nothing could ever bring Clarissa back. Angela, meanwhile, faced a long road ahead, filled with regret and remorse for the choices she had made. The tragedy had left a permanent scar on both of their lives, a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. As Angela began her sentence, she was left to reflect on everything that had happened. She knew that she would never be able to undo what she had done, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. Her time in prison would be spent grappling with the consequences of her actions as she tried to come to terms with the person she had become. Meanwhile, the town moved on, though the memory of the crime lingered. People still talked about the case, about the family that had once seemed so normal but had been torn apart by jealousy and anger. The media eventually shifted its focus to other stories, but for those who had known the family, the tragedy was never far from their minds. In the end, the story of Angela, Clarissa, and Jonathan became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly emotions could spiral into violence, and how a moment of anger could change everything forever. For Angela, the rest of her life would be spent dealing with the consequences of that one night, the night when she lost control and destroyed everything she once held dear. Now, in the quiet moments of her prison cell, Angela thought back to her life before the murder, when things had been simpler, when she had felt loved and secure. She wondered how things had gone so wrong, and whether there had been any way to stop the chain of events that had led to that tragic night. But no matter how much she wished for a different outcome, she knew that the past could not be changed. All she could do now was face the future, one day at a time. Angela's life in prison was far from what she had imagined her future to be. The reality of her actions weighed on her every day. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as she sat alone in her cell, thinking back to the night everything had changed. There was no escape from her thoughts, no relief from the guilt that gnawed at her constantly. She had taken a life in a moment of rage, and now she was paying the price. The days in prison followed the same routine. She woke up early, ate meals that tasted like nothing, and spent hours doing tasks meant to keep her occupied. But nothing could distract her from the memories of her former life, the life she had destroyed. She thought about Clarissa often, about how things could have been different if she hadn't let her emotions take control. She regretted every argument, every bitter feeling she had allowed to fester inside her. But regret couldn't change what had happened. It was too late for that. Jonathan, on the outside, was also trying to piece his life back together. The trial and media attention had left him exhausted, emotionally drained. He still visited Angela from time to time, but their relationship was strained. He loved his daughter, but he couldn't shake the image of what she had done. The loss of Clarissa was still fresh in his mind, and no amount of time could erase the pain of that night. Jonathan often found himself asking what he could have done differently. Had he missed the signs? Could he have stopped this tragedy if he had paid more attention to Angela's feelings? The town, which had been abuzz with gossip during the trial, eventually moved on. New stories took over the headlines, and people's attention shifted. But for those who had known the family, the memory lingered. The quiet neighborhood would never be the same again. There was an emptiness now, a reminder that even the most seemingly ordinary families could be hiding deep, unresolved tensions. Inside the prison, Angela slowly began to accept her new reality. She had once hoped for an early release, but as time went on, she realized that no matter how many years she served, she would never truly be free. The prison walls weren't the only thing confining her, her guilt was a prison of its own. Every day she thought about the life she had taken, about how she had ruined not only her stepmother's life but her father's and her own. The weight of her actions never left her. Angela's interactions with the other inmates were limited. She wasn't looking for friendship or companionship. She kept to herself, preferring the isolation. It was easier that way, easier to keep the distance between herself and the world. She didn't want to talk about what had happened, and she certainly didn't want anyone's sympathy. She knew she didn't deserve it. As the years passed, Angela's memories of her family began to blur. The images of her father, her stepmother, and even her childhood home started to feel distant, as though they belonged to another life. Sometimes she found herself forgetting the little details, the sound of her father's voice, the way Clarissa smiled when she wasn't angry. Those memories, once so vivid, were slowly fading. But the memory of that night, of the moment she lost control, remained sharp, etched into her mind. Jonathan's visits became less frequent over time. He tried to move forward, to build a new life, but the past was always there, haunting him. He couldn't forget the pain of losing Clarissa, and he couldn't fully forgive Angela for what she had done. He carried the weight of both losses, his wife and his daughter. They were both gone in different ways, and there was no bringing either of them back. Angela's time in prison was long and monotonous, each day blending into the next. But one thing remained constant, the gnawing feeling of guilt. She had tried to suppress it at first, to tell herself that it had been an accident, that she hadn't meant to go that far. But deep down she knew the truth. She had acted in anger, and no amount of rationalizing could change that. She often thought about what might have been if she had just walked away that night. What if she hadn't let the argument escalate? What if she had found another way to deal with her feelings of jealousy and resentment? These thoughts plagued her constantly, but they were pointless now. She had made her choice, and there was no undoing it. As Angela neared the end of her sentence, she found herself wondering what life would be like on the outside. She would never go back to the life she had known. The town had moved on, her father had moved on, and there was no place for her in that world anymore. She wasn't sure where she would go or what she would do, but she knew that the scars of her crime would follow her wherever she went. Jonathan, too, had tried to rebuild his life. Though the loss of both Clarissa and Angela had left a permanent mark on him, he still carried the pain of that night, the night that had changed everything. He had found some semblance of peace, but it was fragile, always at risk of being shattered by memories of the past. He had tried to forgive Angela, but true forgiveness had eluded him. It was a wound that would never fully heal. When Angela was finally released from prison, she stepped out into a world that had changed while she had been gone. Everything felt unfamiliar, and she felt like a stranger in her own life. The years she had spent inside had left her with a deep sense of isolation, and she wasn't sure how to reconnect with the world around her. The story of Angela, Jonathan, and Clarissa became a distant memory for the town, but for those who had been closest to them, the tragedy was never far from their thoughts. It was a story of anger, jealousy, and a moment of uncontrollable rage that destroyed everything. Angela would carry the burden of that night with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that some actions can never be undone,